Five.
All right.
Wow. Our first presidential fireside chat.
Yeah.
Who was the president who did those back in the day? It was
FDR.
Roosevelt. Yeah.
FDR.
FDR with his fireside chats. So we're
Oh.
So welcome, President Kyle Washut. Actually, Tom and I were talking about this before the show. We were trying to figure out what we're supposed to call you.
Kyle
So-
works.
So
Okay.
so you're the president of
Yes.
Wyoming Catholic College. Now, you're also just recently having completed your dissertation. Is that correct?
It's completed. It has not. Excuse me. Excuse me.
Yeah, you're good.
I haven't defended yet.
You haven't defended yet.
I needed to
Okay.
do some last minute proofreading, which I thought was going to be really easy to do in August.
Okay.
And then I got made president in August.
And then you were
So I have
made
not-
president. Yeah.
So my goal is to get the proofreading done and hopefully get a defense here in the coming months. But
Okay.
yes, yeah.
All right. Perhaps the first president to defend a doctoral dissertation.
I think that's probably true.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Call up Guinness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
All right.
Yeah. Normally, if you make president, you've decided that you either already have a doctorate
Right.
or you just realize it's not really
That,
important.
that being the head of the university has nothing to do with
That's
academics.
right, that's
Sort of a side job now.
Well, so in an attempt to answer this question, as Tom and I were going back and forth, so I Googled Dr. Kyle Washut, and there is a Dr. Kyle Washut.
My cousin.
Is it the dentist?
The dentist.
The dentist. Okay. All right. All right. So shout out to the real Dr. Kyle Washut.
He and I were always egg toss partners at the family reunion because
Oh.
we go to it.
Okay.
We never won the egg toss at the family reunion. We competed for a number of years.
You can. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Always on the same team.
That's right.
Okay.
Had to do it.
Kyle squared.
Yeah, exactly. Stick together.
Mm-hmm.
No, he's the
Okay.
successful one. So I think he was a successful college quarterback and is now a very successful dentist with a great podcast talking about Washington sports, I think. But
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, we might have to get him
Yeah.
onto the Green Dragon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The old
Dr. Kyle Washut, consider yourself invited to come down to Orlando, Wyoming. We'll get you on the Green Dragon. That'd be a hoot. So, well, good. So we just before we went live, everyone, we were talking with Kyle about different roles of leadership in an organization. And Kyle, you were discussing the difference between the person who's a visionary for an organization, and then what was the term for the other guy?
yeah, so this all comes out of the Traction book series.
Okay.
And it's the they call it the EOS, or the Entrepreneurial Operating System.
Okay.
And they say it doesn't matter what you call them internally. Where a company gets successful is you have the visionary and you have the integrator. And the visionary, as the name would suggest, does the vision. It sets the course for the company, paints the inspiring vision, keeps the company on mission,
Mhm.
holding to their core values, holding to the North Star, holding to what they're doing.
Mhm.
And he has the really important external relationships,
Mm.
whether that's the important clients or the important networking or, whatever the case may be. The integrator is essential, but he doesn't get any of the glory. All right. The integrator is the guy that integrates the three main functions of the business, which is the operational support, such as the finances and the HR and all that.
Hmm.
The sales component, whether that's the marketing or the
So
sales,
getting that product in front of
Exactly.
the market.
and then the product production.
Okay.
Right. Those three are very distinct roles in any business.
Right.
And you need someone that sort of integrates those and puts those all together and holds to it,
Hmm.
and is really implementing that great vision that's been painted by the visionary.
Right.
And as I was telling Jonathan, the visionary is the guy that gets invited to all the parties. He's exciting and he's got painting a beautiful picture. The integrator just says no a lot, but he's the one that keeps the ship.
Yeah. Right. If you want to sail forward, you got to say no to all the other directions that the wind could pull you.
Mhm.
Right. And there's always a
Exactly.
lot of pressures on any institution. So to what extent, according to this series, to what extent are these habits or is this EOS, to what learned versus just sort of inborn?
Right. So they do say that there's very rarely do you find someone who's naturally good at both.
Okay.
And then also it's rare to be able just to do both, even if you're capable of doing both.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And in fact, for the most part, they'll note many entrepreneurs, when they start their company, they function as both.
Mm-hmm.
They're setting the vision, they're integrating the pieces, they're doing the thing, right? But as the company really takes off and it's trying to get traction, hence the name, and really trying to set new records and make new achievements, it's going to be really important to let one person focus on doing the vision and one person focus on doing the integrating. Because if you were trying to do one and the same, even if you're good at doing both,
Right.
you were in fact always only turning half of your mind to these two really essential duties in an organization.
And ultimately, we just only have a finite amount of energy. And we have I think, especially as we get older, our expertise tends to deepen, but also narrow in some ways. Right. As you study more of something, you want to move towards expertise, but that just by itself means that you're going to be saying no to other areas of knowing a little bit about this, a little bit of that, about that gives way to just saying, I need to know a lot about this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have a breadth of knowledge that I'm painting the background, but I'm going to be really good at this thing. My role demands that I be really good at this thing.
Right. So I'm imagining that having been asked to be president of the college, you're asked essentially to step up into that visionary role primarily.
Yeah, that is certainly for a small college like Wyoming Catholic. I'm on the road a lot. My primary focus is cultivating these relationships outside, telling the story of Wyoming Catholic College. And then when I'm back at Wyoming Catholic College, it's just impossible for me to be doing the nitty-gritty details of the curriculum or something along those lines. I need to be able to trust that that's happening and setting the tone and the vision. In some level, it's Father James Schumacher, friend of ours, talks about the need for the monarch to do all the ceremonial things and set the vision and inspire folks appropriately. But, the monarch gets into trouble when he thinks that he can be the court treasurer at the same time. So,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So things are going well when you come back to the office and are like, we hired who?
Well, they do say the visionary should be ultimately he needs to do the final interview for folks because he's, again, one of the things the visionary is doing is preserving the mission of the institution.
Right.
He needs to make sure that every hire that you bring into that organization understands the core values and the fundamental purpose of your organization.
Okay. All right. So visionary, but also gatekeeper to the vision.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He sets the vision, but he also is guarding the mission.
Yeah.
He's the touchstone for the organization.
Right.
So he might not be, so a concrete example. When we're hiring a core missionary, one of our people that go out and lead these incredible outdoor trips for either our students or for in-house groups.
Yeah.
My job is not to make sure that this person is good at backpacking or can follow a compass or read a map or, has the appropriate evacuation or communication skills.
Sure.
That all happens before the interviewee gets to me. But my job is when they come to say, all right, are you on fire with this mission? Are you going to be the kind of person that carries us in this direction?
Yeah.
So I'm going to interview them, but I'm not going to really ask them, do you know your Boy Scout knots?
Right. What are the most dangerous avalanche conditions?
Yeah, exactly.
So on and so forth. So what's been the biggest skill that you've realized, man, I got to work on this if I'm going to lead an organization? In other words, where have you felt the most in over your head?
That's a great question. So many areas. I am fairly convinced that the modern administrative structure that we put into institutions really demands that you be good at so many things that really the ultimate thing that you've got to be good at is choosing good people and then delegating accordingly. And I'm kind of a terrible delegator. Truth be told, I think especially coming up initially as an academic, As a faculty member, you don't delegate. You
Here, I'll get you some more. water.
great. Sorry. Geez, I don't know
You're good.
what is catching in my throat here. But as a teacher, right, you don't delegate.
Mhm.
You are responsible from start to finish
Mhm.
through the teaching process. You set the syllabus, you are thinking of the readings, you are doing the studying. You can't tell your secretary, hey, could you please read Herodotus for me?
Mhm.
So, and they give
Give me
some
the
teaching
notes.
notes, right? And I'll go in
Yeah.
and teach. Maybe there's some person that does that, but that's a terrible teacher, right? But when you're in an administration, that's just the nature of the beast. You need to delegate.
Mhm.
You need to be able to say, hey, look, I trust you to be able to do this.
Mhm.
And I can set the general direction, but I need to let you do this. And so luckily I have a great team of folks that give you lots of feedback on how I do that better.
Right. Yeah. Right. A good team is one that's not afraid to tell you the areas in which you're falling short, but
Yep.
Right.
a great team's not good for one's ego, right?
Right.
The problem if you're surrounded by yes men, but let's face it, yes men have an appeal.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
The organization might run into the ground, but at least you'll feel good about
You'll feel
yourself
great every-
all the way.
Right,
Right.
right.
Exactly.
Right. Be patted on the back as the ship sinks below the water. So, so you're leading this organization, you're defending a dissertation, you have a family of 6 kids now. Where do you find the breathing room in
Sure.
the current life that you have?
So, so I'm the youngest college president, as far as I know, in America, and I'm at the youngest accredited Catholic college in America.
Mm-hmm.
And when people ask, why did the board choose someone so young? I'm pretty convinced they just wanted someone they could run into the ground. And so, yeah, there is a lot of, where do you cut back on things? You cut back on sleep, and you've got to be a father to your kids. You've got to make the soccer games and the recitals and see the events, and you see the plays. You got to do that. You got to stay up for bedtime stories. You got to find time to take your wife out for a date every once in a while.
Sure.
And then be present to.
You can't have your assistant take your wife on a date.
There are some things you can't delegate, as it turns out. You got to be present to the leadership team. You got to be present, and then on the road telling people at the college. A lot that's very consuming.
Mm-hmm.
And so I generally, Alex Jones, the CEO of Hallow, told the story, said that when he was in the middle of starting Hallow, the prayer app, things were really hard. They're trying to get investors. It was really difficult. And at one point he just prayed and he said, God, all right, look, I think this is a really good thing. I think you want me to do this. And if it works at this point, if it works, I will spend the rest of my life giving you all of the credit. But on the other side, if it fails, that's your fault too, right? Like this is beyond my power to do. I feel like that's very much the case, right? There's
Okay.
practical tips and things I can do about, like, okay, make sure to get up in the morning to have time to pray. Make sure that I don't miss the key moments for a kid's life or something.
Right. We can hit pause.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's there's trips and various tricks or various tips you might offer. But in the end, it really does come down to, I think, having a kind of humility before the thing, which is hard for me.
Yeah.
To say, look, I cannot do this. I'm not Superman.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got to trust that there will be wise people around me to tell me when to take a break or what to focus on.
Right. There's a plain sermon by Newman where he talked about, where his rhetorical question is of the mass of Christians that are in the world today. And, obviously he was writing a while ago. He says, how many of them can really point to genuine differences in their own lives of their life that they have versus the life that they would have if they had been non-Christians merely pursuing their own flourishing. My question is, you read things like that in Newman, right? You remember Patrick Powers, an academic of a previous generation. He would say one of his favorite phrases was, "The good Christian should be tired," right? We live in an age of, self-care we're told that self-care should be at a premium. And even in Christian circles, that message is generally encouraged. Do you think there's genuinely a tension between the sort of, hey, you need to take care of yourself, self-care model of looking at your life versus the real duties of the Christian?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question.
Very cool.
So Father Simeon Cook, founding president of Wyoming Catholic College, he's now hermit in the New Mexican desert.
Yeah.
When there was talk about me becoming president, my daughter, my oldest, who is his goddaughter, was chatting with him for her monthly spiritual direction talk. And he asked, well, what do you think about the possibility of your dad being president? She said, I don't really like the idea because I think it'll be really tiring for him and he'll get worn out. He goes, good. Good. That's what the Christian life's for, is to pour yourself out, is to take up your cross. And this idea of not doing the great vocational thing because, it'll be hard, or I'll, in fact, not be able to give myself sufficient self-care. Father Simeon's like, no, that's just garbage. Go for it. Pour yourself out. Now, I say that leading into your point about tension, because we all know that, C.S. Lewis has that great line in The Four Loves: you can tell the woman who lives for others by the hunted look in the eye of the
Right.
Yeah.
There's a way that you can sort of pour yourself out in a kind of parasitic way, right? Like just, C.S. Lewis describes it as, you bring her in and you have lunch prepared and she says, oh no, thank you. I'll just take a little bit of toast. And so that means you have to stand up and actually go and make a special toast for her so she could be sacrificial and not eat this smorgasbord that you've created. By the way, could you make some toast, Jonathan?
Yeah, this water's great, but we're gonna need you to pop in. Yeah, some gluten-free, sugar-free, dairy-free toast.
Yeah,
you got that over in the kitchen.
We get this. So I think there is, and I'm sure you guys see that too, right? Like a real tension in both. Look, we know we need to take care of ourselves to some extent, but that over and over again, I am constantly amazed that the fasting traditions of the church, the vigil traditions of the church, the missionary zeal of the church really does ask us to do things that are above and beyond. And somehow in those moments, there's a special grace that comes in and fills the gap.
Yeah. Because there's this, I remember you giving an interview a few years ago. We were talking about the Virginian, and you described the Virginian as a man who is wholeheartedly pursuing his own flourishing, to use that phrase again, right? And I think there's a way in which many of the Greek figures, both from mythology and history, we could point to those figures and say, yeah, they, not in an evil way, but they are pursuing their own flourishing. Is there basically a scandalous departure from that pursuit in the Christian life?
Oh, in the early church, that was certainly a complaint that the Roman patricians had. That especially when their young men would go off and become monks, and then they'd go. There's this account where this one Roman patrician goes to an island of monks and discovers them unwashed and wearing ragged clothes and living on vegetables that they dig up out of the dirt with their bare hands. And he looks at this sorry mess of men that could have been great Romans in the Senate, right? Gone to the gymnasium, taking care of their bodies, eating a healthy diet, gone to get because the Romans, certainly in the late antiquity, the Romans were very concerned about self-care.
Yeah.
They had this health regimen and these various things. He could not understand how these young men could so abandon themselves as to just be these disgusting images of monks on the beaches of this island.
Right, right, right. Yeah, there's what's that term, Tom? Father water waste. Yeah. Father water waste. So now we've got right. So that brother water waste.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Father Waterways generally, he's at least in the popular image of it, he's always a little bit aware of his effect on people. He quicks his hair just so and knows the girls are fainting as he walks in. Where
Right.
these monks had just given up on it, right?
Right.
But I think it's hard for us in America because the Catholic Church spent so many decades trying to become respectable, trying to be not a persecuted minority.
Mm-hmm.
That the idea of saying, hey, actually to be a good Catholic means to be this radical, self-sacrificing person.
Mm.
We're not really comfortable with that. We want
Right.
to be a little bit mainstream and leaders in the mainstream.
Right. So it was the church of Italian and Irish immigrants who were, both generally having a lot of trouble finding any sort of estate in the American project, generally speaking. And so decades went by in which, yes, like how are we going to have some sort of defense for the rights of our own people in the American project? Well, that requires having some level of success and some entry into the governing body of the United States, which means, we have to have our hair combed and our clothes clean,
We do the respectable things that you do for self-care.
Right.
So that we're not total, immigrants.
Right. Dirty immigrants.
ostracized.
Yeah.
Right? No, we're stand-up Americans, by
Right.
golly. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember being I remember being in New York. And this was on another admissions trip back in the day. I met with this Black family from New York, but their last name was Collins. And I had known them for years. We were good friends. So at some point I said, like, all right, guys, you just got to tell me, like, you're a Black family going back how many generations, and your last name is very Irish. This is a name that my mother grew up in an Irish neighborhood. Every other family was named Collins. And what they told me was, it was actually very common for there to be intermarriage between these families descended from slaves and families of indentured Irish servants, because they basically occupy the same tier in society, say 150 years ago. And so, and so you have this long tradition of these Black people with these Irish last names, and that's basically how it happened. And I just remember being fascinated by it, and just wondering, there's got to be so many interesting stories, and anyway, but in a certain way, that drive towards respectability in the Catholic Church, it really worked,
Right.
but then it kind of backfired.
Right.
What are your thoughts there?
Well, I will say, so with I got a lot of thoughts about the backfiring, but I want to circle back to at some point. There is, even within the tradition, before we get into selling out for respectability,
Right.
Going back to St. Francis de Sales, St. Thomas Aquinas, this concern about a healthy sense about self-care that does come in, right? So that we'll circle back to that. But right now we're focusing on how we bent the stick a little bit too far the other way. Yeah. Okay. So you're right. I think we focused so much on being respectable that at a certain point we lost sight of when we were compromising on things that we couldn't compromise on.
Okay.
And I think we're seeing, that really hit its peak.
2002, right, was the sort of the rise of people's awareness of some of the cover-ups that had happened.
Right. There were the cover-ups we did with the real abuse, where we didn't want to announce that because that would kill the respectability. Real compromises on whether we would take public stands on points of morality, real compromises for Catholic universities on whether they were going to insist that people had to, promote church teaching, or whether they wanted to become prestigious research institutions where they could hire any professor, regardless of whether they were necessarily at all supportive of Catholic teaching, right? So there were a number of these shifts that we started doing, that we got really giddy that JFK was our first Catholic president. And okay, no, maybe he had a little bit of trouble with his marriage vows, but by golly, he's a
Yeah.
Catholic, right? So there was a sense where it became an identity badge, maybe more than a creed,
Okay.
more than a moral
Ah,
code.
okay. Yep. Yeah. 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 No, that's really tough because on one hand, it seems to me true that you're constantly sort of in kind of this diplomatic relationship with these other goods, right? Where the Christian life asks that you hold one good first and foremost, right? And that's in the Psalms, right? Like, let my right hand wither if I do not count Jerusalem the first of my joys. Right. But on the other hand, never does it say all these other goods are to be entirely ignored.
Right.
So we're sort of constantly in tension because, well, we have to sort of keep these other goods in orbit.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But we can't let them just fly off. But the more the more we try to keep them in orbit, the more they risk coming entirely too close. So
now, one of the things I think that the church brilliantly did in those early years when they're trying to reconcile this, right? In those early centuries, there was a whole lot of debate about, well, should you just in fact completely abandon all those earthly goods? Or do you abandon any claim about any kind of superiority to this asceticism or self-denial in the face of those goods? And you had groups on both sides pushing to extremes because in general, right, doing the Catholic both and is really hard, right? So one of the things that was said, and that's really where we see the fruits of, Lent emerging in part. There were various things that led to the forming of Lent. But one of the things that emerged as Lent was forming was an emphasis to say, look, for 6 weeks a year, for a kind of tithe of the year,
Okay.
You can really devote yourself to living out an intense kind of self-denial. More than you would normally do if you're living in the world. If you're a monk, you do a kind of extreme witness all the time. But during these 6 weeks a year, everyone kind of says, look, I'm going to live as much as I can in this radical witness way, knowing that will have ripple effects in my life, knowing I've got to live in a world where these other real goods have to be kept in orbit, and I have to have a work-a-day job and go to parties and be respectable and tell the funny joke at the cocktail party or whatever the case is. But there's this time where I can practice in a special way, living that radical focus on Christ.
Right.
And so that seems to be the guiding principle of the church is, look, we're fallen. So even if we're trying to be like, well, I keep a good balance, you probably need to practice with that exceptional witness at times. Whatever that exceptional self-sacrifice, which is probably a little bit more than just giving up chocolate 6 days a week.
Maybe
It's a start. Yeah.
Right. But some way of practicing to help us do both of those things. Like you said, keep the goods in orbit and also practice that radical focus.
Right. Wow. Yeah, it's challenging. I remember a couple of years I did Exodus 90. It was funny. So we did Exodus 90. I think it was 2019. A group of us at the college did it. And it was good. And I felt like it really helped me through some things. But then we did it again the next year, but it was 2020. So it was like it was Exodus 90 rolling right into Lent. But then Lent basically coincided with the COVID crisis. So it was like, I remember it was like Exodus 90 followed by lockdown 30, followed by no socialization 60, followed by COVID 720. You know what I mean? Yeah, it was just like the worst time of life.
And you're thinking, I really could have gone for a warm shower.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Nice.
Yeah. I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago, and he's like, I was talking about Exodus 90. I was like, hey man, maybe you should do it. He's like, do those seminarians down in Texas who invented it know that their water was always 50 degrees? Like, Do they know that water in Wyoming turned into water yesterday? It was ice for the last 1,000 years. No.
It's true. The water comes out awfully like
Mm.
that. I admit, I was when I attempted Exodus 90, the cold showers, I just was not willing to sacrifice
Mm.
that good to be kept in orbit. I'm just a wimp when it comes
Right.
to cold showers.
Right. Well, I mean, and that's what I said to a friend of mine. I said, well, you know, for Lent, I gave up warm showers, but actually, as it is turning out, I think I've just given up showers altogether. You know, you're just not eager to get into that. Yeah, I was like, well, do I really have to? So, but speaking of different traditions, you're born and raised in Wyoming, you grew up a cowboy. I think you applied to a rodeo school only to have it
It
close.
closed.
Oh, no.
Which I think my mom is thankful for it.
Yeah.
That was her. I was like, I'm gonna go into rodeo, and she goes, we have to go to the rodeo school, and the rodeo school was closed. And there may have been another one. She did not point it out to, and then she's convinced that's why I'm still alive today. But
Right.
yeah,
So, I mean, so you've grown up very much in this tradition of the West, and yet for the last 10 years, you've really been involved in the Byzantine Catholic Church primarily. Is that right?
So longer than that, actually.
Okay,
All right.
okay.
So when I was, well, in fact, when I was 12 years old, I watched a news story about the miracle that got Edith Stein beatified. And in fact, it was a miraculous healing of the daughter of a Melkite priest.
Okay.
Oh.
And so there's this news story, I remember CBS or NBC or something, and there's this priest standing in front of this iconostasis, waving this incense and chanting, and then talking about his daughter being miraculously healed. And I'm thinking, how does that work exactly? What's going on? And that was my first introduction to, well, there's this Eastern rite of the church where there are a different set of traditions and that are basically the traditions of the Eastern Orthodox Church, but you know, they're in communion with the Pope. And so then I've got to find out about this. Why did I think I had to find out about this? I still don't completely know, but it just resonated in me. And I'd see in phone books, they'd be advertising Byzantine Catholic. I'm like, I've got to go there when we're traveling. And my mom's like, what is wrong with this kid? What is going on? So we'd go down to Denver, and for a while, my family was going down for a medical issue for down to Denver about once a month. And I would, when the hospital we were was relatively near where Holy Protection Catholic Church of Denver is. And so I would either take taxis or some other way or another, buses or whatever, get to this Holy Protection Church, and started going to this Byzantine Catholic Church. And again, my mother's fairly confused about what exactly is going on.
Should have taken him to that rodeo school.
Exactly. What is going on here, right? And then I went to Southern California and would go to the Byzantine Catholic Church, which was about an hour drive from TAC, where I was at school, and was really sort of thought of myself. So really from about 16 was really moving toward thinking of myself as
Okay, so this was pre-college.
Catholic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now then, as it turns out, there's various canonical structures and things in place so that you can't just decide to start calling yourself a member of a different tradition within the Catholic Church without having some apprenticeship and pastoral authority and guidance. But I went to Austria, lived in Austria for 3 years. And while I was in Austria, I was formally accepted as an Eastern Catholic, member of the Eastern Catholic Church, one of the Eastern Catholic churches. Yeah, and it's a
And
strange.
which one is that?
So I'm a member of the Ruthenian Catholic Church.
Ruthenian. Okay.
So yeah, it's just sort of a strange thing. And why that happened, I only found out later that my family is from Poland, and they grew up right at the base of the Carpathian Mountains. And the Carpathian Mountains are this string of mountains that go sort of through Poland into a section of Ukraine, down into Eastern Slovakia, a little bit in Romania and Hungary. And the group of people that live around those mountains are called the Rusyns. or in Slovak, we might, or the Slavonic, the technical translation might be the Hick Slavs.
Slavs.
Slav.
They live, sort of in the mountain. They're the mountain folk Slavs.
Okay.
And they're not they're not Polish, they're not Ukrainian, they're not Slovak, they're not Romanian, they're not Hungarian, but they're Rusine, and they have a kind of dialect that's common throughout. And at some level, I guess, this tradition, which was not sort of passed on consciously by the time I was growing up, of being in the Carpatho-Russian mountains and praying this Eastern Christian tradition, was just in my blood at some level. I don't quite know how to explain it otherwise. That sounds maybe superstitious or something, but I don't know how else to explain why it would resonate so intensely with me. But there it is.
I think many of the members of our audience are probably not familiar in a general way with some of the large differences between
Sure.
the Roman Catholic rite and other rites. Can you just give us a quick overview of
Sure.
that?
So here's when the Christian church emerged in the first centuries, there were various centers of Christianity. And at those centers of Christianity, different traditions would develop, different ways of worship, different styles of discipline, spirituality, even ways of articulating the truths of the faith. What's remarkable about all of them is they all have the same fundamental principles. The what we would call in the West the seven sacraments, what we would call a conviction about devotion to the saints, devotion to the Mother of God, canon law traditions. They're there in a way common strikingly throughout all these different centers. But in the early days of the church, there were different centers sort of marked out. One was Rome, the West, and there was in Rome, there wasn't anything over time. There wasn't anything that really rivaled Rome in the West, and it became the sort of defining center as time went on. But you have Antioch in Syria, Alexandria in Egypt. You have the Armenian Christians in the nation of Armenia. You've got the in Baghdad. At one point, 2/3 of the Christian population lived in Baghdad, or under the Catholicos of Baghdad, in the tradition of Baghdad. And then you have Constantinople, where the Eastern Roman emperor would set up his capital eventually. And within those different locations, there emerged what we're going to call different traditions, broadly speaking. The Byzantine linked to Constantinople, the Alexandrian, or what will be called the Coptic at Alexandria, the Syrian centered in Antioch, the Chaldean centered on Baghdad, the Armenian centered in Armenia, and the Latin centered on Rome. All right, now each of those are going to have different ways of worshiping, different liturgy styles, different observances for the fasts, different disciplines about marriage, various things along those lines, different spiritualities, ways of expressing it. So if you walk into an Eastern Orthodox church, the thing that strikes you are all the icons. As George Costanza says in Seinfeld, the funny hats the priest wear, that's really attractive evangelical piece.
Right.
They dress a little bit differently than with the Roman collar or something like that. So that's roughly the structure. And so within that Eastern Christian tradition is that Byzantine tradition went up to the Slavs. Cyril and Methodius are the ones who evangelized the Slavs and sort of went up and really formed the Slavic people. And they inherited this Byzantine tradition. So what happens with the Slavic Byzantines is you get this Greek Byzantine Christianity with the icons and the divine liturgy and focus on the fast and tradition of married priesthood and various things, mixed with the kind of
and you would say it's
Russian
kind of this hybrid of Greek tradition woven into Russian cultural Slavic
Slavic cultural stuff. Right.
cultural
Exactly, exactly. So, the things that are, really key for the Slavs, machoism, cold, snow, um,
Suffer,
good
suffering,
food, suffering, right, kind of moroseness. Yeah, so, but also a kind of dialogue, a more explicit dialogue with the Latin tradition, because the
Okay.
Latin tradition is just like right up next to them.
Okay.
And so that becomes this character of the Slavic Christianity. And that's what's going to characterize the Eastern Christian church that I'm a member of.
Okay. Okay. If you compare someone who's from a Ruthenian rite to someone who's from a member of a Coptic rite, are you going to see as many differences between those two rites as one of those rites to the Roman Church?
No,
Okay.
no. So interestingly, in the West, there's a lot more variation between the West and the other Eastern churches than the Eastern churches amongst themselves.
Okay. All right.
In part, I think that has to do with proximity.
That makes sense.
That in the early church, there was a lot of back and forth between the Egyptian church and the Byzantine church and the Syrian church. And there was less back and forth between those churches. There were still some, but there was less back and forth between them and the Roman church.
Okay.
And then especially after Charlemagne, there was a much sharper divide between Eastern,
Okay.
just even politically, right? It's even prior to Charlemagne, once you get the fall of the Roman Empire, then the West is kind of the hinterlands. It's not really as in much active dialogue with the East.
Okay.
Now again, not never separate, never completely separate.
Right.
And then you add to that the Vatican II reforms, and at this point, the Western Church looks fairly distinct from the Eastern churches.
Yeah. How do you respond to some of the, I'm actually going to use the word accusation, but the comments at least that, Christ willed the kingdom of God and what he got was the church. Right. So, right. So a lot of people look at, the life of Christ, and then they look at, the current rites in the Catholic Church, and they say, what happened? You know what I mean? All like Christ was, he was homeless, but he was also plucking the heads of the wheat. He wasn't holding to all these fasts. He was praying outdoors. He wasn't running. He doesn't seem to be running to synagogues every Sunday. And damn it, all the rules came back. Are we Pharisees again? How do you respond to these people? Because I think they have, in our culture, they own some rhetorical high ground.
Yeah, I think the first thing to note, just historically, right, when we think about the Pharisees, when we think now about what it means to be a Pharisee, we are reading that through the lens, especially through the lens that the Reformation gave us of a faith versus works culture.
Okay.
And so we say, oh, what was the Pharisees? The Pharisees were obsessed with works. Christ was obsessed with faith. That's the big difference. That's not actually what the big divide was. So for example, if you look at Mark chapter 7, when our Lord's debating with the Pharisees, one, it's a really hilarious chapter, because in the chapter right before, Christ has just done the miracle of the loaves and the fishes for the first time. He's fed the 5,000. There's 12 baskets left over. Then he walks on water. He heals a few people at this beach town, and then the Pharisees come.
Yep.
And the Pharisees come in chapter 7, and they say, hey, they go to the disciples of Jesus, and they're like, how come when you guys eat, you don't wash your hands? Now, the meal that immediately preceded this was the miraculous feeding of 5,000 people out in the desert. And the question the Pharisees ask about that meal is, how come you didn't wash your hands? Okay. Now, the question about washing hands is a really interesting one, because nowhere in Leviticus does it say that the average Jew has to wash his hands before he eats dinner. It's not in the Mosaic Law. We don't know that because by the time we start reading the Leviticus, our eyes start glazing over. It's got to be a law somewhere in Leviticus.
Right. There's a lot of. If someone were to quiz us, hey, is there a law about washing your hands in Leviticus? Most of us would be like, Yes.
Seems right. The Pharisees were obsessed with that.
Right. That's
They
on
were-
brand.
They
Yeah.
were obsessed, they were obsessed with the Mosaic law, so that's what's going on. That's not what's going on. In Leviticus, it says that you have to purify yourself in a ritual bath before you eat the food of the sacrifice.
Mm.
Oh.
And so if you were going to eat temple food, or if you were a priest who only ever ate temple food with your family, then you had to eat your food in ritual purity. And over time, there's this question about, well, what do you do further? Around what we're going to call the Second Temple period, there's an increasing desire at this rebuild of the temple after the Babylonian exile
Mm.
to extend certain pieties associated with the temple outside of the temple precincts.
Okay.
And
Because
so
we finally got the temple back.
we got the temple back, and we really want to
Let's not mess it up again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we lost the temple because we weren't keeping the law. So let's be really over the top in how we keep the law.
Hmm.
So the Pharisees, one of the things that seems to have characterized the Pharisees was this idea that everyone should ritually wash their hands, not a full-scale immersion, but ritually
Hmm.
wash their hands. So they're in a kind of ritual purity
Hmm.
for eating food.
Hmm.
Mm.
So when Moses responds to the Pharisees, it's a debate about a pious custom that has applied about extending temple piety. Similarly, and then our Lord goes on to say these various other things, but his main argument with the Pharisees is fundamentally about what it means to extend temple piety. And he says, you're hypocrites because you're extending it wrongly.
Hmm.
You extend it in such a way that you don't notice when God's actually doing something really amazing, like feeding 5,000 people off of breadcrumbs. You're extending it in such a way that you're saying you don't have to take care of your sickly father if you pledge your money to the temple.
Hmm.
Right? You're extending temple piety in a weird way that misunderstands what the temple's for.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus says in Mark's gospel, no, it's Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, there is someone greater than the temple among you.
Mm.
And with him.
Mm-hmm.
That his whole point is the temple exists so that you can recognize God and become transformed to be like God.
Mm-hmm.
And the Pharisees have focused on the temple exists to give us rituals to demarcate us from the other.
From the
peoples.
others.
It's not fundamentally a moral code. It's not fundamentally, though, they're concerned about morality.
Mm.
It's not fundamentally about transformation into God. It's fundamentally about ethnic demarcation.
Mm. Which, in their defense, they would have been able to point to historical examples when ethnic demarcation was ignored, and that seems to inspire God's ire.
Right. But there, the thing you remember is that ethnic demarcation there is always a means to an end.
Mm-hmm.
God says, don't marry the pagans because you'll stop worshiping God.
Mm.
Right.
You'll cease to be transformed into God, and you'll miss the whole point. But now the Pharisees have said, we're going to start doing temple rituals so that we don't marry the pagans.
Right.
The ethnic demarcation has, in a sense, become the reason.
Mm-hmm.
So again, you can see how that gets into a faith and works thing, but it's
Right.
not actually the debate with the Pharisees.
Ah.
The fundamental debate Jesus has with the Pharisees is you need to be focused on the temple as a place to encounter God so that you can participate in divine life and be transformed.
Mm.
And while I'm here, focus on me. When he ascends into heaven, the question is what rituals, what structures do we have
Mm.
so that we can be encountering him, be
Right.
transformed into him.
Right. Yeah.
So a different debate.
A different debate. Yeah.
That helps clarify a lot though, because it is a question. It's like, I think we all have in the back of our minds. It's like, where did the Pharisees go wrong? And why did they have so much sway? And then, why did Christ give such a hard smackdown on them?
Right.
Yeah.
I am sure that if I had lived at that time in history, I would have been a Pharisee, right? I would have been, is it Gamaliel?
Mhm.
Right? I would have totally been the guy being like, well, we don't know yet. Let's just see how this movement goes.
Mhm.
You know, and if it's of God, it'll flourish, and if it's not, it'll like I would have been a Pharisee.
But here's what the early Christians say about, they say, okay, you can tell the Pharisees fundamentally misunderstood this
Mm.
because when the temple was destroyed,
Mhm.
they didn't understand what that meant. The temple's
Oh.
destroyed. There's no more temple. There's no more sacrifice, right? There has not been a Mosaic sacrifice according to the law of Moses
Mm.
for almost 2,000 years. And the Pharisaic tradition becomes the rabbinic tradition that says, okay, the thing we're going to cling to is all of these extended temple rituals
Mm.
that we developed in the that we're extending temple piety.
Right, right.
And
Yep.
so the early Christians are like, look, Jesus was right. You fundamentally missed it. All of a sudden, this was not about encountering God in the temple. It was about washing your hands. And that became the focus of piety. And maybe for a good Jew now, it can actually be a really moving encounter with God. But you're not doing the law of Moses anymore.
Mm.
Mm.
Because you're not doing the temple anymore.
You're sort of doing the extraction, the meta material of the law of Moses.
Yeah.
Yeah. Man, it's wild. Oh. Man, where were we? What was our original question, Tom?
That's a good question.
Get out.
We were talking about like the difference between like Coptic and Latin, like the difference between the rites there, and then I think that led to kind of understanding the more biblical.
Oh, so yeah. So the question was, how do we relate all these different rituals and traditions?
Oh, right,
and
right, right.
things
Yeah, yeah.
To the message of Christ. So the point
Yeah.
is, with the church, when there's all these different traditions, one of the points is the church does not identify one sole set of traditions.
Mm.
What the church recognizes is the important thing is the reality of Christ and being transformed into the new temple.
Mm.
And so if in Baghdad they developed a certain set of traditions around the Eucharist that are different from what they did in Egypt, which are different than what they did in Syria, which
Sure.
are different than what they did in Rome, it doesn't matter. What matters is there's the Eucharist that we're being transformed by
Mhm.
that's divinizing us. Now, is the church guilty of doing the thing the Pharisees did over time? Are people in the church guilty of this? Sure.
Mm.
That what became important is the ritual itself, abstracted from the encounter with God,
Mm.
Mhm.
or a mark of religiosity or something like that. Yeah, it's a problem.
It's kind of like the old ladies that like rattle the rosary beads against the pew, but will speak to you very unkindly after church.
That's right.
During
That's right.
church, you
Yeah,
know.
that's right.
Yeah, and I think if we're honest, we all have instances of that in our own lives.
Right.
I think if I were to make an argument specifically to members of my own culture in the 21st century in America, I would say, look, at some point, even on a human level, if you want to be better, you have to be disciplined, right? And that applies to diet, that applies to exercise, that applies to earning a doctorate, right?
Yep.
Even again, to use this term that's come up a couple times, even if you're pursuing your own flourishing, right?
Mhm.
At some point it involves discipline.
Mhm.
And you could decide to set rules for yourself, right? But at some point you got to show up to the gym. At some point you got to study for the test, right? The church is basically saying, like, look, we are trying to get you to heaven because there's this pull towards hell. We need you to do this. And I think at some point we have to say to members of our own culture, look, the church is making this argument. You are slipping comfortably to hell. We are trying to get that turned around. You have to do something for us. Here's what we're setting as a standard. And that's uncomfortable to our peers in our culture.
Well, the other thing I'd say is that what the church is focused on is not only getting to heaven, though that's by only getting to heaven. Obviously, that's the thing, right? Yeah. But what we mean by getting to heaven is we don't mean heaven is like the millionaire acres you get to go to after good behavior in the game of life.
Mhm.
All right. What we mean is heaven is the full realization of the participation or the sharing in divine life that Jesus has opened up to us even now. And so the reason why it's so important that I go to church, or that I fast, or that I do these things, it's so I can be more like Jesus. Not in the sense of just like so I can be nice to people. Oh, it's important to be nice to people. But actually so I can share divine life, be transformed, be transfigured. That's the focus. And so all of these rituals, all of these practices are for the sake of even now making us share in that life that Christ lived while he was on earth.
Mm-hmm.
And heaven is the unveiling of that.
Hmm.
And we're constantly threatened to think that's not the most important thing. The most
Okay.
important thing is my self-actualization, drink, or whatever the case may be. And that's what takes us to hell, which is namely the absence of sharing the divine life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a very, I guess, like simple but engaging understanding of like what it means to live the faith. Because I think it's very easy to like for people to think like the church is just a moral code giver.
Mm-hmm.
That's very common. A lot of people that I've talked to are all like, well, why do you follow the church if it just gives you moral codes? Why don't you just go to Christ himself in the Bible? It's like
Right.
they're usually go to, or yeah, and they always think it's like hell is God wanting to just punish people instead of showing it's like a choice of not following him and accepting the life that he gives to us.
Right.
So it's just like this, kind of like a shattered glass effect when people forget like what is the main thing. They start seeing all the reflections of parts of the gospel of faith, and they get distracted and they just kind of fall away because they don't really see the full image there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Who would you point? I mean, these are people you're encountering in the
Mhm.
gym, Tom. Is this people who have a kind of generalized Christian background, or people who are like, no, I've never darkened the door of a church in my life?
I would say like mostly work, gym, just people I encounter in
Mm-hmm.
local daily life. Um, it's like if you bring up the idea of like living the faith, and not even like saying I'm Catholic, but just saying like going to church on Sundays. Like
Mhm.
sometimes I just say like I'm gonna go to church on Sunday, not even say I'm going to mass, and just see what they would say.
Okay.
And I'd be like, oh, that's a nice idea.
Okay.
They see the importance of like trying to live in a religion,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't really see like the main purpose behind it, that there is sin, there is major consequences to how we live.
Mm.
And I think the reason is because there's so much confusion about what actually means to live a good life.
Mm.
Because there's so few examples right now, I think,
Mm.
living. And
Well,
there's
I would
such a
say that there's perpetually few examples of
True,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
But there is one thing that gives me hope is that people notice when something is bad and they don't want it.
Right.
But they don't really know how to get something that's good. It's kind of a limbo state.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I remember having a conversation with two doctors several years apart, and uh, and in the course of the conversation, it came up that my family and I were both, we're all practicing Catholics, right? And their comment was both very similar. I expected them to be a little resistant, but actually they were actually quite enthusiastic about the idea that we were members of a church, and they think, oh man, I think religion just does great things for people who are part of that organization, right? And it popped into my head that for them, religion was like Pilates, right? Like this was a way to keep people away from drugs. This was a way to keep people away from suicide and depression and all those really negative things. Like this is a support network. This is a social group, so on and so forth. And so I think that's a common attitude about religion. Like, hey man, if you're into it, by all means, fast from meat and so on and so forth. But then the church goes and makes these extra demands where it's like, hey, even if you're not part of our club, you should be. And I mean, the Catholic Church is like the vegans of today. You know what I mean? We're like, everyone should be doing what we're doing.
So what we're saying is the common attitude toward religion is actually an attitude that's more similar to the Pharisees than to Christ.
Mm,
because the common attitude to religion is to think of religion as a way of demarcating and setting off certain behaviors
right.
Yeah.
that let you be in a club that lead to a certain kind of flourishing.
Right. That leads to a benefit.
In virtue of these behaviors.
Mhm.
They're not ordered to a transcendent, transformative encounter with a reality that's beyond the scope of this world.
Mhm.
They're fundamentally markers that are used for defining your life here. And sure, by all means do that. Where they freak out is they're hearing us preaching a Pharisee gospel. And they're like, whoa, guys, that's over the top.
Mm.
The Pharisee gospel could not make those demands on people.
Mhm.
If it is just a Pilates club
Mhm.
or a demarcating way for self-actualization,
Mhm.
then yeah, you can't make those demands.
Mhm.
But if instead it is the gospel that Christ preached, which is I'm pointing you to a reality that transcends this one,
Mhm.
that will transform your very life, and that's what happiness consists in, then by all means we can make those demands.
Right.
So then they accuse us of being Pharisees. Like, how come you're so obsessed with the rules?
Mhm.
But it's because they think religion is fundamentally the thing the Pharisees thought it was.
Right.
Mm,
Right. But in a certain
Yeah.
way, in a certain way, some people outside the church actually understand the message better than inside the church, in that they're like, why you are making demands on everybody.
Right.
Right. They actually do understand why they understand the message, which is you're trying to guilt trip me.
Right. And there are, in fact, some people in the church who are like, no, we're just the cool Pilates club.
Right.
You're like, okay, no, that's actually not the way to win this argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Going back to what you said about being mainstream accepted,
Mm.
the way to be mainstream accepted is basically to say we're a Pilates club.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Right. Right. And people might be comfortable with us preaching the benefits of that club all day long, but as soon as we say, and everyone has to do it, they're like, whoa.
Yeah.
You're vegans.
I'm
Right.
gonna order meat still.
Yeah,
don't
right,
judge
right.
me.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a catch-22, because then if you just say it's a Pilates club, then like, well, why is it so special? Why do I need to be a part of it?
Couldn't I be just as healthy if I wasn't doing Pilates?
Right.
And only like a CrossFit nut says that you have to do CrossFit to be fit.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Mhm.
that's a little bit too zealous. Like,
Mhm.
again, if you reduce it to that message, then
Yeah.
there you are.
So then they have a lot of sway in their arguments, because what they're debating about is a similar level with some other religion,
Right.
Right.
not
Right.
saying that there's just one true religion.
Right.
Right.
They haven't really heard the gospel because we haven't really preached it to them.
Hmm.
Right. If we try, so am I understanding you correctly? If we try to say, Christianity or Catholicism, it'll help you to be more generous. It'll help you to be more connected with your family. It'll help you order your priorities correctly, blah, 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 blah. Those things might be true,
Right.
but it leaves us open to someone saying like, well, actually, being a Stoic leads me to
Yep.
flourish in my family relations.
Watching Oprah helps me flourish in my family relations.
Yeah.
Right. Like, exactly.
Mm.
It's again that fundamentally inversion of means and ends.
Okay.
It's true, being a good Christian makes me a better father. But being a better father is not the reason to practice Christianity.
That's tough. Yeah. Yeah, that's challenging. Okay.
That's fun to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. Kyle, you did an interview, I think about a year ago. You said power and pleasure, for many in the modern world, power and pleasure determine the world around us. I think you were speaking particularly about young people, but maybe our culture in general. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. Well, let's think just concretely of the experience of being on social media.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now I'm old, so my social media reference point is Facebook, but we can
Not according to the board. We got
choose any other social media reference that you want, right?
Mm.
And here I don't mean the whatever the platform ostensibly is for.
Mm-hmm.
I mean what the algorithms are dedicated to getting you to click on.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's TikTok, whether it's YouTube, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Instagram, the algorithms are directed to getting you to click on things related to sex
Mhm.
and your attractiveness,
Mhm.
or happy vacations or various things, or things related to you getting lots of money
Mhm.
and being really popular.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, at some level, those are sort of, I'd say, bougie versions of a focus on power and pleasure.
Mhm.
A billionaire doesn't have to be focused on those bougie sort of packages of power and pleasure. They're able to focus on raw power in a different kind of way, or unadulterated pleasure in a different kind of way. But for us in the middle class masses that are getting marketed to,
Mhm.
generally the marketing we get is for fancy vacations or for romantic relationships or for getting money.
Okay.
But the reason we want money is either for the sake of more pleasure or for the sake of being influential,
Mhm.
of having a kind of control, of being able to make certain demands, of being able to affect political change, whatever the case may be.
Mhm.
And so that the world tells us over and over again, how do you know whether you're a successful human being?
Mhm.
Well, it's a measure of how powerful you are, how influential you are, how much authority you can command, either through your money or your political influence or your boss power,
Mhm.
or how much pleasure you're getting.
Mhm.
I think Lewis hits that with the triple G's. You know, we want. He was speaking of men, so he says girls, gold, or guns, right? And in that way, I think he basically says sex, money, or at the guns. He means power.
Power.
I believe.
Right. And money there is attractive because it's a medium for either of those other two ends, for pleasure or for power.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And the billionaires ultimately realize that it's really just about power. That when you're trying to just use money to buy pleasure, you get satiated pretty quickly.
Mhm.
And the focus is just power. But
Okay. So you think there's a genuine psychological limit to man, I can have as much pleasure whenever I want and as much as I want, and it gets boring.
yep.
But you think there's a way in which power it stays sexy longer than pleasure does.
Well, there's a way in which you can never max out on power.
Okay.
There's always something more you could control.
Mm-hmm.
Very true.
Right? Where
Okay.
you can get a certain point where you're satiated of pleasure. Like I
Okay.
can't, my receptors can't absorb any more physical stimulus.
Right. There are probably billionaire there are probably power brokers out there that are almost as ascetic about pleasure as the holiest monk.
Yep.
But it's because they've moved past pleasure.
Yeah. Pleasure's a game millionaires play. Once you're a billionaire, you realize, like, I'm comfortable. Sure, fine, whatever.
Sure.
But that's not what it really comes down to.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I mean, just thinking about how many not very good billionaires are trying to cause massive change across the whole world, like George Soros, for example,
Yep.
like wanting to infiltrate everything in multiple countries to try to overturn it towards his ends.
Mm.
And he's 90 something or other, and he's still doing it.
Right.
You think he'd get tired?
But that's his
But
purpose.
power doesn't.
Yep.
You don't get tired of trying to play the power game
Yeah.
in a way that the pleasure game runs out.
Right. And the power game can masquerade. Right. The power game, as we know from the last temptation that the devil offers Christ in the desert while he's fasting,
Mm.
is, I will give you the kingdoms of the world so you can do good things.
Yeah, Ratzinger talks about this in what's the book? Like
Jesus of Nazareth.
Jesus of Nazareth. It's like I will give you I will allow you to solve world hunger.
Yep. You can solve world hunger. You can solve the desire for religion. You can influence all the things. All right. So that, it's not immediately obvious, right? Unless you're a Disney villain. For the most part, you don't admit to yourself that I just have this raw desire for unadulterated power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You want power so you can do good things.
Mhm.
But in the end, the demands of power are themselves the thing you're living.
No. Okay, but going back to your quote for a minute. So you think for the great mass of people alive today, what we're being sold is some power pleasure combination, right? Particularly for those who are younger, pleasure might be at the forefront. Those older, power might be at the forefront. But for most of us, it's some hybrid.
That's it. That's what we're offered.
And so we're being taught by social media to view the world as avenues to one of those things, perhaps some combination.
Right.
Okay. And you think that, help us out here. Do you think that liberal education by itself is an answer to this? That faith is an answer to this? Or both are required?
Great question. So let's think of it this way. When we were little kids, we were probably all asked, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Okay.
And it didn't matter how kind and saintly your kindergarten or first grade teacher was when she asked you that question. She did not expect you to answer, I want to be a virtuous human person who is excelling in his human faculties on the greatest objects that he could apply them to. Sort of stare at you blankly. Like, no. I mean, do you want to be an astronaut or the president of the United States? But that question, fundamentally happening from kindergarten on, tells us that the reason you go to school, the reason you go to grade school is so you get into a good high school.
Yep.
The reason you go to high school so you get into a good college.
Mhm.
The reason you go to a good college is so you can get a good job. And maybe that requires graduate school if you want to get a really good job, but maybe not. And, well, why do you want to get a good job? So you can make a lot of money. Why do I want to make a lot of money? Well, so you can get pleasure and power. And then set your kids up, because that's a sign of power, that you can set your kids up to also get
To repeat the cycle.
power. Right, exactly. Right. So there we're told from the very beginning that the point of life and the point of education as the thing that gets you to the point of life is pleasure and power. Okay. And again, this is not to bash all those kindly kindergarten teachers who asked us if we wanted to be asked.
Yeah. Shout out to Mrs. Canfield. You were a wonderful kindergarten teacher. I especially enjoyed the covering pumpkins around Halloween.
But you are in a system that is training you from the beginning that how you decide what you want to be when you grow up is based on pleasure and power.
Okay.
So liberal education is by its definition a fix for that.
Okay.
If we understand liberal education rightly. If we mean by liberal education, we mean classical education, which is just to say we read these texts in this mode for the sake of being cultivated people so we can get good jobs. And that's not a fix for it.
So
That-
that's another avenue for the same end.
Right.
That's kind of what sinks the, the classic studies classes that everyone at Princeton has to take.
Right.
Right. It's just another way to demonstrate your rhetorical skill.
Right. Right. If you go to Oxford and you look up various liberal arts degrees, whether it's religion or various things, their thing that they'll lead with is, well, here's the jobs you can get. Here's the successful placement you have. And so let's be honest, most liberal arts schools are guilty of this to some extent, right? We're talking about what our alumni do and how successful they are. So see, if you come to a liberal arts program, you too can be successful. You can be a host of a great podcast in Lander, Wyoming, while also being a successful realtor, right? Just wait, right? Something like that is, a pitch you might make. But that's not selling liberal education. That's, I think, selling the trappings of liberal education, but telling you that in the end, look, you can even use this mode of education, maybe even use this mode of education better for the sake of getting a good job and pleasure power. But if we start talking about liberal education as this thing that we do for its own sake, as this thing that we do because there are appetites of the human person that aren't satisfied with merely pleasure, physical pleasure and power, but there's a kind of appetite for spiritual delight
Hmm.
that's for its own sake. And liberal education trains you to do that,
Hmm.
trains you to do that well.
Mhm.
Then we're breaking out of the system.
Mhm.
And that's in some ways the same message that the faith is offering.
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
That you have
Interesting.
an appetite for a spiritual delight
Hmm.
that's for its own sake.
Okay. So a liberal education the true aim of it is steps. Oh, is steps in a different direction than every other proposed end of education that the world currently offers.
Yep.
Okay, and in the end, that the liberal arts, in your view, can be married to a faith-based perspective because both of them offer a departure from mammon.
Right. That's fundamentally when we say it's a liberal education or the education of a free man.
Mm,
We don't mean you're free because you have enough pleasure and power to not be slaves to anyone else.
okay.
We mean you're free because you realize what defines human happiness
Mm,
is that you have these spiritual powers that are meant for spiritual delights.
uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Mm. Yeah.
What occurs to me is one time you and I were working an event together, and it was arrival of new students. And one understandably concerned father stood up and asked in front of a crowd, asked the administration of the college, all right, okay, my daughter wants to go here because apparently she really likes reading the Iliad. What is she going to do when she graduates with the degree that you offer, right? And I, as the admissions guy, jumped in, be like, whoa, we got doctors, we got lawyers, we got successful business entrepreneurs. You know what I mean? Like, and frankly, I was making this appeal based on, don't worry, your daughter will be able to gain her share of mammon.
And there's something true about that, right? Like, namely, it is just also the case that our students of the liberal arts are set up to be capable of the kind of things that makes you flourish in the workplace. But they're also able to know that that's not what their happiness consists of. And
Okay.
that's the important thing. So I think we want to say both things.
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
Dad does not want to hear, well, my daughter will know like that she's really happy
Right.
and she's living in my basement forever.
Right. My daughter is happily living in my
Yeah.
basement.
Right, we want to do something more than that. But it's again, in some ways, it's the Pharisee question,
Okay.
right? It's saying, well, right, are my spiritual appetites for the sake of some earthly good? Or in satisfying and pursuing that spiritual desire, of course, there will be certain earthly benefits that might happen.
Okay. Right. The world rightly ordered can be a shadow of Eden. Right.
Someone who's a good thinker, yeah, they're going to be good in business meetings too. But you don't become a good thinker simply for the sake of being a good person in a business meeting. That I think is it's again that ends and means and remembering, well, what we started with, the one thing needful. That even self-actualization is a result of the one thing needful, but not making the one thing needful for the sake of self-actualization.
Right. Which is a constant temptation.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Right. Because it's a way to keep it there. Oh yeah, we're going to do the one thing needful in order to X, Y, or Z.
Well, it reminds me of like what Christ says, like seek first the kingdom of God and everything else will be given to you. It's interesting that he says that because it's like, well, do what's most important, and then I have everything else figured out for you in addition.
Right.
But if you just choose those things, you're not only going to lose those things at the very end, but also lose everything else.
Right. Yep. Unless a grain of wheat. Yeah. You've got to let go of it.
Yeah.
That's right.
I've heard people defend the liberal arts, or sorry, let me clarify. I've heard people say that a good liberal arts education should take any student and challenge their current paradigms of the world, right? if you look at Hillsdale, you look at the University of Dallas, you look at WCC, any of these current crop of liberal education institutions are drawing in students who have a Christian or Catholic paradigm, right?
Mm-hmm.
If these people are to be believed, right, who say, oh yeah, a liberal education should make you question the answers, so to speak, a liberal education should make you question these religious paradigms that you have. To what extent can you endorse that view of a liberal education?
So I'll give my favorite answer. Yine.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's this great Austrian word. In German, you say ja for yes and nein for no.
Hmm.
And so you ask Austrians questions, and their favorite answer is always yine.
Yine, yeah, like elves and Tolkien, you know.
That's right.
Yeah, yes and no.
Yes and no, right? Yes and no. So I think it is just true that any person getting a liberal education will feel their worldviews at times challenged and rocked and shooken.
Okay.
Okay. That's not because the fundamental goal of a liberal education is to make you challenged to believe that there's actually goodness in the world, or that there's truth that can be known, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think those of us, all three of us, have had the experience of a liberal education, of moments when the question is posed so strikingly that we realize we had the right opinion
Mm-hmm.
about our worldview. We believed based on the right testimony of others, or we said the right words about this truth or this fundamental reality. But those words had not penetrated into the depth of our soul. We didn't really see what they meant.
Mm. Mhm.
And that radical paradigm shaking moment happens when we realize, oh, I didn't really know that. I was kind of repeating the words, or repeating it. Plato uses this analogy, right? I described the way to the land based on the way others who had gone there before had done, but I'd never been there before.
Right.
And that a liberal education at its best gives you the moment of actually seeing for yourself. Now, to get there, there's a kind of world-shaking moment when you have to give up the opinion or the words that you thought were the truth,
Okay.
and actually come to see it as true.
Okay. Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that the goal of the liberal arts education is to make you leave behind the Christian worldview,
Mm-hmm.
but rather to make you really know the Christian worldview.
Okay. To make it your own in some sense.
Yeah.
I mean, that would certainly resonate with my experience of teaching Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where I remember when I first began teaching as a purple belt, I would basically regurgitate the way it had been taught to me. Put your arm here, grab this head, blah, blah, blah. And I remember, so that was at purple belt. And to be fair, I was teaching it correctly, and I was getting other people to do it correctly. Like, let's not discount what was happening, is people were doing it correctly under my instruction. But it wasn't until I was really like an upper level brown belt, right, which is kind of the last step on the journey to black belt, where I was like, oh, this is why you put your arm there. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the dialogue, Plato's dialogue, the Meno. Socrates makes this distinction between right opinion and knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And he notes that right opinion can get you there correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The guide that doesn't actually know the way, but repeats rightly the directions he heard from someone else. If you follow his directions, you will get to the destination as surely as the person who has done that path a million times. But the difference is the guide, who only has opinion, can be misled. Socrates gives the image of a statue, right? It's a statue that could be carried off. Someone could steal it from him. But when you know it, you know the why it's tied down. It's unshakably held. No amount of sophistical argumentation is going to make you doubt this anymore because you have seen it for yourself.
Sure. Sure.
Hmm.
What was described for us, I mean, when your own liberal education was occurring, I mean, what was the most stark moment for you that could be described as a crisis of faith, to use an easy term?
So, yeah, for a number of people in my class, it was reading David Hume, the Scottish skeptic who just gives one of the most brilliant critiques of religion that there are. But for me, I was like, okay, that's fine, right? I wasn't moved by that. The man who shook me the most was Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And Edward Gibbon is writing a story, right? He's writing a history. And his fundamental thesis is Rome was great. And going back to a theme that we were hitting earlier in the conversation, right? Rome was wonderful and marvelous. And the thing that killed Rome was Christianity. And these pusillanimous.
They took their eye off the ball.
That's right. These pusillanimous Christians came in. They started arguing about whether it was homoousios or homoiousios or how we, parse this particular obscure portion of Trinitarian theology, and concerned about devoting all of their time to how ascetical they could be, and killed Rome. The greatest thing ever known to man. Killed it.
The peacekeeper of the world.
Right. Right. These lame pacifist weaklings blew it.
They turned the other cheek, and look what it cost us.
If they'd just been able to have the great men of Rome again, but all the great men of Rome got obsessed with this religion and became bishops, not senators.
Mm-hmm.
It was doomed. It was done.
Or worse, hermits.
Hermits, right? Yep. And so Gibbon hits this point over and over and over again.
Okay.
All right. Just in incredible, beautiful prose. Like no one can write a satirical skewer like Gibbon.
Mm-hmm.
And so this sweeping epic narrative that was presented so beautifully and so compellingly really shook me. Because I could read Hume's sort of bald arguments and think through the pros and cons and conclude like, no, we can refute Hume this way or various things. And they were hard arguments. It's not like I was like, oh, I'm a genius. I don't have to listen to Hume. No, I really wrestled David Hume or Immanuel Kant or some of these folks, right?
Yeah.
And I probably didn't fully understand them. That's a safe thing to say because I was, a young 20-something reading them for the first time. But they didn't shake me. In the way that Gibbon, who just seemed like a kindred spirit, he was this guy who loved story, who had a beautiful sense of the word. And he could tell me a story that told me the story of all of my heroes, all of these great Christian saints, that explained why they were failures.
Yeah. They left the gate open and the Huns rode in.
And it was crushing.
Yeah.
And it just demoralized me. And in fact, to be honest, the mode of education I was studying didn't really fully equip me to respond to Gibbon. It was a very, very, I am so profoundly appreciative for my undergraduate education. It has made me the man who I am today. I became an intellectual there, like irreplaceably good in so many ways. But I don't think the philosophical answer was, for me, a sufficient answer to Gibbon.
Interesting.
They couldn't explain how this guy who wrote so beautifully and so compellingly, how to respond to him. What I needed was a better storyteller. I needed a better epic.
Okay.
And the mode of education I was doing gave me great tools to respond to David Hume and Immanuel Kant. But not such great tools for responding to Edward Gibbon.
Okay.
And so
precisely because he was a sort of kindred spirit with a Barry or a John Senior.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so, yeah, so much of my life was my graduate education, and the rest was in some ways pursuing how do we answer Gibbon?
Mhm.
How do we tell the better story?
Mhm.
How do we tell Christianity as an epic,
Mm.
but where the good guy wins?
Yeah.
Right. Right. Mhm.
What was your, if you think you found the answer or?
I think I started on the answer. And I think it was teaching junior year theology at Wyoming Catholic College.
Hmm.
That at some level, teaching that's about the fall and the redemption and the Christology.
Mhm.
And in teaching that year, I found that the fundamental way to teach that year is to tell the story,
Hmm.
is to tell the story of humanity,
Mhm.
of which the Roman Empire is an important part,
Mm.
but to tell the story of humanity as an epic.
Mhm.
What was our fall? Why did Christ come to save us? Who is Christ and where are we going? And when you tell that story, it's a recalibration of priorities. It's a recalibration of the goods,
Mm.
and a way of saying, yeah, those things that Gibbon said are good are still good, but they're not the ultimate goods.
Mm.
And I think Gibbon, I've also done enough history to think Gibbon's wrong about some key judgments he makes. But
Oh, interesting.
I think fundamentally it was learning with my students at Wyoming Catholic to tell the story of Christ, the fall, and our redemption and who Christ is.
Hmm.
Okay.
I mean, I've had a few of those questions like come up from school and then from other things, but like if you keep asking yourself why is that true or not, I think you almost start finding the answers through daily life too.
How
Like
do you mean?
um well, for instance, I was listening to a marketing guy on how you sell your idea of your company,
Mm-hmm.
and he was saying that you want people to be part of your story.
Mm-hmm.
And he said pretty much every big story, every movie that has got won the Oscars, everything, it's generally three things. It's someone that's on a journey, they encounter a seemingly impossible obstacle to overcome, and then they somehow get over that obstacle and win.
Right.
So that's the story of Christ. That's the story of like superheroes. That's pretty much like every story. And your question while you're watching the movie, for instance, is like, how do they do it?
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
What's their way of getting over this?
You got to get the audience to really think, man, maybe they can't, maybe no one can do this.
Yeah.
Mm.
And this guy who was talking about it, he started a company to sell like beautiful clothes for young girls. And it started from his wife who was abused as a child. So this was her way of like giving back to children
Mm.
the life she never had.
Mhm.
So a very
Mhm.
beautiful story, but his thing was like, well, how do you sell your idea to your customers? Like they can also be part of this idea to give their daughter a beautiful life with just like these dresses and parties and things. So very, very cool guy. Um, but that I think brought a lot of the question like from Brothers K, for instance, was like, is there hope and should there be suffering? You know, like massive questions.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
But if you start looking in your daily life of like you seeing what kindness or love did for someone, it did give them hope and it was worth getting through the day for that one moment. You know, like these little things to start answering those questions and then you start framing it through your other experiences like past memories, stories of other things in the world, and it all starts to make a cohesive sense. Almost indescribable for a while, but then you start understanding it more and more. You start finding the words to describe it.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. The Brothers K example is actually terrific, right? Because it seems like Brothers K is, in a sense, the Grand Inquisitor specifically. It is a kind of version of the Gibbon story,
Yeah.
right? The Grand Inquisitor is a person who's basically been convinced by Gibbon
Mhm.
that Christianity leads to poor, starving, desolate masses, and what the world needs is the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And so, in Dostoevsky's way of telling the story, the Grand Inquisitor, the Roman Church, the Jesuits have remade the Roman Empire
Mm.
by
Well, you're not going to go hungry.
right, by denying the message of Christ. We're going to fix the food problem. We're going to fix the security problem.
Mm.
We're going to give you the spectacles you need.
Mhm.
but we're not going to do the Christian thing.
Hmm.
So in some ways, the Grand Inquisitor basically believes the given story.
Yeah.
And Dostoevsky
He-
is saying, I need to tell a better story than he does.
Right.
But that's old. The Gospels would claim that that's ultimately the temptation of Christ. It's like, you of all people, God come to earth, need to fix the problems. And Christ says, that's not what I'm here for. I'll heal some people, but I'm not going to heal everybody. And I'm going to ascend before all the problems are fixed.
Yeah, I'm not going to become the Roman emperor, the eternal Roman emperor.
Mm-hmm. The one man qualified to be so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Damn it.
Well, Luke sets him up that way, right? Like there's the story of Augustus, and he's going to tell you an evangelium, a gospel, an evangelium, a message, an imperial message, but it's this message of this tiny little baby born in Bethlehem that dies in Jerusalem.
Okay.
That's the better story. And there's maybe even some evidence that Luke, when he writes his gospel in the Acts of the Apostles, is writing it as the better story to Virgil's Aeneid.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
I'm telling the better story. I'm telling the story of the Roman Empire, but not culminating in, Augustus, but culminating in Christ as present in Rome in his church.
And is it true to say that you have to either have a liberal education or a faith formation to say yes, because the girls, the guns, and the gold are not our focus?
I think that's right. I think that's right. I think Aquinas says that you can get this with hard study and much learning and many errors, or you can get it by faith.
Well, and so that's actually something I wanted to ask you about. Carlson, in one of his first promotions, for members of our audience who are not familiar, Robert Carlson was the first academic dean of the college, Wyoming Catholic College, and then also a co-founder, of course. One of his first promotional lines was, education will save the world. Do you have to draw some issue with that?
Yeah, I think it's, well, I'll say yine.
Yine. I think we've just found the title for this episode. Yine by the Fireside.
There we go.
I think it is the case that well, this is the thing to know about Christian education, is it's a spiritual work of mercy.
Okay.
And to call it a spiritual work of mercy, for the church to list it amongst its lists of spiritual works of mercy, means that in some way education participates in extending the redemptive work of Christ to the souls that it's offered to. And so education is a spiritual work of mercy, will save the world, insofar as it's an expression of Christ's saving work for the world.
Mm-hmm.
If you mean, unless you go to college, you can't be saved, that would clearly be false.
Right. Sure.
But it is certainly the case, I think we would say this, that Christ wants to redeem the whole person.
Mm-hmm.
So that even the humble high school dropout or an 8th grade educated person clinking their rosary beads and following the faith, who's never really studied Aquinas, or maybe even is illiterate or any of those points.
Sure.
They don't encounter the faith as a dead letter that doesn't illuminate their intellect.
Okay.
Their mind is illumined in some way by their encounter with the faith.
Okay.
And so for
Far from being the opiate of the masses,
yeah,
you want to say, no, faith can actually be the illuminate.
Yes, exactly. Faith authentically understood.
Mm-hmm.
Faith is a real encounter with the reality expressed in certain words.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be an inarticulate encounter with the reality.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The illiterate may not necessarily be capable of writing the Summa Theologiae or something, right? But I do think it would be wrong to say that when Christ redeems us, he's not trying to redeem the whole of us. He wants in some ways for our minds to know the truth. He wants our wills to long for the good. He wants our bodies to express that.
Mhm.
And that can be imperfectly happening in this life. But again, if salvation is us participating in divine life, and that's happening even now, and it's fully revealed in heaven, our bodies imperfectly are redeemed right now. Our wills imperfectly are redeemed right now. Our minds are imperfectly redeemed right now. But there is not a redemption even here and now that isn't expressed in some way in our minds, and our wills, and our bodies.
Right. It may be partial, it may be faltering, but it is real,
Yeah.
right? Like, right. The redemption of our soul has something to say and something to do with how we treat our bodies and how we treat other people's bodies.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Right. Wow.
And so with our minds too. Right? That there's no like, I don't think about it at all. Like, if you really believe this is the divine word that you are submitting to in faith, of course you think about it.
Yeah, of course.
Right. Of course, you should bring your intellect to bear on it. Yeah. This, I think this touches on it, but frankly, I've also I wanted to get your thoughts on, the AI. Are we experiencing revolution? Are we experiencing just a new cultural artifact? I certainly don't have a clear sense at this point. What are your thoughts about at least the public engagement with AI in the last 24 months? Because I mean, as Paul Giesting has said, AI is an 80-year project.
Right.
And I think that's true, but it is certainly true to say that something has happened in the last year or two.
I think it's right. So let's say it's an 80-year project. Okay, fine. Cell phones were an 80-year project or more, right? Television was a long project, right? Once we had certain breakthroughs, it explodes rapidly and develops in rapid, incredible ways. But the build up to those projects, as scientist Paul Giesting will say, for example, has been a slow, steady progress of science. Fine. So I'm not going to answer the question about AI as a scientist, because I'm not a scientist, and so I can pretend, but that one I do. I think the thing I will say is, culturally, we're not ready for AI. Because culturally, we still really haven't caught up to what to do about the television in our living. Right. And so when I say culturally we haven't caught up, I don't mean by that there shouldn't be televisions or there shouldn't be cell phones or various things. But there came to be a point where the introduction of the technological advance into culture outstripped culture's ability to process the change it was having on it.
Okay.
Now, I think in part that's because the technology itself is meant to make you skip certain aspects of culture. So let me give an analogy from Wendell Berry and then go back to that. Wendell Berry talks about the difference between roads and paths. Okay, and he says a path is a habit of relationship you have to the landscape by which you figure out what the right way to go from A to B is. And it's part of a tradition. It responds to the actual contours of the landscape and gets you there.
And it's extemporaneous in a certain sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it sort of spontaneously happens, and then if it is right, is this interesting combination of memory and the actual way the landscape's set up.
Okay.
The hills here, the creeks here, and so you do this and you do that and you get here. And you do that a number of times, and your son does it, and pretty soon there's this worn path for the way you get through. But then there's roads. Roads can be built on the route of paths, but normatively the road is the fastest way to go from here to there involves ignoring as much of the landscape as we possibly can. Building bridges, carving out a mountain, chopping down trees. There we go. We got a road. Okay.
It's planned.
It's planned and sort of superimposed. And Wendell Berry says, and the epitome of the road is the modern interstate. Right? You drive across I-80, and at some level, you are barely aware you're going from different geographic settings to another geographic setting.
Mm.
It's all the same. It's going as fast as possible. We're going to dynamite obstacles in our path. We're going to invoke eminent domain on private property,
Yeah.
and boom, there we go. If you drive across I-80 and you say, I drove from Sacramento all the way to the East Coast on I-80, and you say, and therefore I visited all the states on that path, people are gonna be like, you didn't really.
Yeah.
People have an instinct that
Yeah.
you kind of missed it.
Yeah.
Mm.
You've driven through them, but you don't know them. Okay. So let's take this as a fundamental distinction. Paths, roads.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. It seems increasingly with modern technology that modern communicative technology, especially, let's say with TVs, etc. We're developing roads, not paths. We're developing things that are not sort of in a relational interaction, but meant to skip as much as possible the relationships or the limitations that you find yourself in. So television is meant to skip as much as possible the limitations of time and space.
Yeah.
So once upon a time, if you had a community theater and you wanted to put on Macbeth,
Mhm.
you had to get your local actors and you had to put it at your local theater and you had to deal with the resources and the acting talent that you had in your local area.
Right.
Now we get to watch Macbeth with actors from London,
The best possible performance of Macbeth.
from right anywhere in the world.
Right, exactly. So this came up. This was brought home to me here in Lander. Lander's one of the few places in the country that I'm aware of that still has an active adult baseball league, not just an adult softball league.
Uh
Because we're committed to putting our adult men in the hospital with much more regularity.
huh.
But there used to, there was for years there was a Sunday game between the Lander Adult Men's Baseball League and the high school baseball team.
Okay.
And they'd play off and on. They'd play on Sunday afternoons. And at one point, I was out there embarrassing myself on the field, and my wife was sitting in the stands, and she was talking to a gal that was sitting next to her, and the gal said, she goes, "Oh yeah, it used to be that everyone used to come to watch the baseball game on Sunday afternoon. That was the town's entertainment. They all came and they watched the baseball game." And Aaron said, "Oh, when did that stop?" She goes, "About the time there was cable television, we could watch pro baseball."
Oh.
And which is fair. Like, as proud as I am of when I pull off an amazing performance at the Lander Baseball League, it pales in comparison
Hmm.
to what a bad game is for a pro baseball player.
Mm.
And that's already maybe a little bit too exalted to even dare to make that comparison. But it's just not as good a baseball, right?
Hmm.
But before television, the way you got baseball or the way you got Shakespeare or the way you had music
Mhm.
was you made it
Mhm.
and you appreciated it as a town. So there are real benefits, like to experience of excellence in various things.
Hmm.
But that's also true of news, right? Now, because of television, you can feel like the news that is happening in Washington, D.C. or New York City is as existential and pertinent and pressing to you as the local news.
No.
So much so you don't pay attention to local news. Okay, so that's the case for the
Right,
television,
yeah.
right?
Okay.
This is transcendent space. Then we invent the internet.
Mhm.
And we put that on the computer and we add that. We still haven't societally adjusted to the television.
And all of a sudden,
And all of a sudden we got the internet.
everything is here right now.
And now, forget a TV infomercial. Now you can just click and buy and like it's all there and going.
Hmm.
And then we decide to put that internet in
In our pocket.
And whoa, we have not begun to catch up with what are the cultural norms that should govern that.
Mm.
How do you possibly preserve local community
Mhm.
in that situation?
Mhm.
Okay, so if that's the situation where we are already culturally 70 years behind the pace of technological progress, and now we add AI,
Mm.
how can we possibly use that as responsible cultural humans?
Hmm.
When the thing that we've done with the most powerful computers more powerful than what put the man on the moon, the thing that we've done is make 30-second twerking videos that
Yeah.
so that's my thought on AI.
Yeah, that's a bit of an indictment, I'm
Good thought,
afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do really like that example though of the paths and the roads.
Mm.
I think helps put it into a lot of perspective of like, what's the charm that was lost?
Mm-hmm.
Like I know, especially like going to WCC, it was always way more fun having open mic nights and hearing your friends sing songs that you knew than it was just putting the song on and
Right.
just listening it with your friends.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. And so, Jeremy Holmes, the academic dean at Wyoming Catholic College, makes the point of in an age when we are surrounded by more professional music than ever,
Mm-hmm.
we also find fewer and fewer people capable of making music.
True.
Because instead of going Christmas caroling, we turn on Spotify for the Christmas carols. And we hear great Christmas carols, like really good Christmas carols.
Right. Pentatonics is kicking it. Yeah.
Easy.
Yeah. They're outstripping the Pleasant Acres Christmas caroling party.
Right. So the thing is, again, to go back to roads and paths,
Mm.
right? A road, to the extent it is just making a path better, is a really important advance.
Mm.
Okay. A road, and to the extent that part of making the path better sometimes involves making the path wider, sometimes involves changing the landscape, various things. Those of us that have, tried to do a construction project on a cabin where the only way to get the construction tools to the cabin is over a path have really cursed the fact that there's only a path.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But so we don't want to say it's bad to have roads. So we don't want to say it's bad to have technology. But we're saying culturally, the relationships that develop around the roads are really important.
Mm.
Mm.
And if our ability to construct these roads outstrips the ability to build a culture around them, which I think has clearly happened with the interstate and clearly has happened with television and the internet and smartphones,
Mm.
that's where it's a cultural crisis. Not so much the technology's bad,
Right.
but a crisis of the culture for relating to the technology.
Yeah, I remember someone commenting like, "I'm not They were saying, "I'm not questioning that alcohol gets abused, but our culture does have rules about alcohol that, if followed, will actually keep alcohol mostly a beneficial thing." Right? We usually have it around food. We
Yeah.
normally have we we almost always have it around food. We almost always have it after the workday is done.
Mhm.
Right? We don't drink and use alcohol, right? We do have rules in place. What you're saying, Kyle, is that forget having rules about cell phones. We don't even have rules about television.
Right.
And we're coming up on 100 years of television. We're not there yet. but-
Right. Yeah. So, let's forget smartphone for a moment, just phone. When I was growing up,
Mm.
there were rules that accompanied answering the phone.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You didn't answer the phone at dinner time.
Mhm.
There was an answering machine for that.
Mm.
There was a certain etiquette of where you answered it.
Mm.
We were old enough that we had corded phones, but even when you moved to cordless phones, there were still certain rules about if you're going to answer a cordless phone, you move yourself away, or if you're in the middle of something, there's a way of culturally dealing with the phone,
Mm.
which is admittedly a thing. It's a kind of road, right? It's a way of making present someone who's not physically in that space.
Okay.
But we had rules for it.
Okay.
What rules and etiquette are there for when you answer a cell phone?
Usually it's just like, if you gotta take it, you take
You
it.
just take it.
But if you don't gotta, you wait 10
You might-
minutes.
Right. And if you're, if you're a good person, you can probably have it on vibrate if you're in a meeting or
Yeah.
something, right?
Hmm.
But there's not actually a culturally approved norm about when you don't answer your phone.
Hmm.
And instead, the cultural assumption is, well, you can basically answer the phone and should answer the phone anytime, anywhere.
Hmm.
And you need to justify why you didn't answer the phone.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But if you could be in a great conversation, and if my wife calls me, I'm sorry, Jonathan, I gotta stop.
I
the podcast.
gotta take
gotta
this.
take this."
I gotta take this. Yeah.
But there's also no way of, if you're from work and you called someone at their house, there was a kind of cultural presumption about what that would take for your employer to call you on your home phone.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Okay, so as an employer, there's hardly any guidelines for when I can call my employees on their cell phone,
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
which is terrible, right? I have a thought, I'm like, I'm going to call so and so.
Right.
It's a Saturday afternoon,
There's nothing that says you don't do this on Saturday afternoon.
right?
There's nothing that says you don't do this at 7 p.m.
Right. And maybe he doesn't answer, but and then if I had texting to that, right? Okay, so
Yeah.
all right, there it is. We have not developed cultural norms about how to balance my in-person community
Hmm.
with this technology. Instead, our cultural norms are solely based on the technology.
Hmm.
Television, I think, is the same boat.
And you think AI is another iteration of the same problem?
Right.
Do you think that, how to put my question more precisely, are you less worried about whether AI can replace human intelligence, whether AI will surpass human intelligence, all those questions? It sounds to me as if you're saying those questions may come up, but the fundamental problem is humanity generally, Western culture specifically, doesn't have any rules in place about what it is to live a human life. Therefore, this is how we relate to technology.
And because our custom is, therefore, we let the technology dictate what it is to live a life.
Okay.
We are actually setting ourselves up to feel even more bizarrely acutely the questions of, can AI surpass human intelligence?
Because we're ungrounded.
Because we're ungrounded. It's not like we have this really healthy, robust sense about what the human intelligence is in personal communion.
Mm.
Okay.
Instead, I'm most likely to see wow, the AI can do the human thinking thing better than I can.
Yeah.
Would you answer back to some, because I could stand here and say, actually, yeah, Kyle, like as of Chat GPT 4, A, B, C, and D can be done better by the AI. Would you answer back and say, well, actually, you don't know what human thinking really is?
Right. So that namely what you've done is you've risked doing the road versus the path.
Okay.
You've risked saying, these are the ends I can imagine that are important. AI can do all of those ends. And I'm not attentive to the things that are getting bulldozed and locked when I say that.
Hmm.
And so I'm not actually thinking about what can the human intelligence do.
Mm.
I'm only defining what the human intelligence can do in virtue of the technological capabilities in relation to these few ends.
Like, crap. Like, man, it can play Go better than we can.
Yeah.
Chess happened 25 years ago. Go happened, I think, like 3 or 4 years ago. Now I'm sure it's gonna conquer stock picking
Right.
within the 18 months or something like that.
And let's say it does.
Mhm.
Okay. Let's just say that in the end, data analysis and stock picking, no human intellect can beat AI at.
Mhm.
Okay. Wendellberry will be like, yeah, that's kind of like saying no path meandering down the mountain can beat the interstate. in terms of timely transportation of a RV from one destination to another expensive destination.
Mhm.
But if you asked the person that was meandering down the mountain path, does it fundamentally defeat the purpose that an interstate does better than you do
Mm.
on this path? The person would sort of misunderstand the question. Like, I don't know how to compute.
Mm.
There's this culture associated with the mountain path
Mhm.
Mm.
that is non-existent at the interstate.
Right.
What's the culture about human minds? If all human minds are supposed to be do are efficient tools for getting money, power, and pleasure,
Mm.
We might as well say, yes, AI, how can we integrate with AI
Right.
so that we can better gain knowledge, which will lead to power, money, and pleasure.
That's right.
That's so interesting. So
Yeah.
a year ago, I did a road trip with a buddy, and he's like, "Hey, man, I want you to fly into this city. I'll meet you there. I'll pick you up, and then we're going to drive, from there was somewhere in the Midwest to Colorado." And he's like, "But we're staying off the interstate." I mean, we were on roads. Make no mistake, we were on paths, but we were still just on those state highways.
Right.
Man, and it was different. I mean, we went through towns where we're like, man, this town is thriving. And then we went through towns where like it reminded us of that great line in The True Detective, where it's like, this is someone's memory of a town, and even the memory is fading.
Mm.
And then we would drive another 100 miles down the road, and we stopped at this great barbecue place, and we just got this great, we had this great meal that like you can only have it in Chauncey, Nebraska, because that's the only place where Chuck is doing barbecue, like
Right.
it's not a McDonald's, right? And I mean, forget paths. We were just on the state highways, and we were feeling and smelling the places where we were in a way that Highway 80 just doesn't allow for.
Yep.
Where, yeah, you don't even go into the towns on 80. You just go to the rest stops, and you get mobile gas, and you get McDonald's food, and you get back on the road, and you drive 200 miles, and you get the same food and the same gas 200 miles away.
And the rest area looks almost identical.
Right.
Well, that's, I had the same experience. We drove back to my brother's wedding in Ohio, and my sister and her family and my family and I, so 17 of us, we bought a school bus,
Mm-hmm.
and we drove the school bus out on meandering highways all the way out to Ohio, and the way back we drove on I-80.
Mm.
Okay. I-80 was terrible. Like all the things you imagine about why it would be terrible to travel with 17 people, most of which, like all but 4 of which were under the age of 15, are exacerbated by the interstate.
Mm-hmm.
Because the interstate's only defined by getting you from one destination to another as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
There is no cultural component to it.
Uh-huh.
So it's just, exactly what you were saying about Chuck's barbecue.
Yeah.
Kind of reminds me with the idea of paths and roads is like, when you encounter, let's say, art, which is the path, you're encountering someone who's trying to master a craft. And it reminds me of like I think this was Kung Fu masters. They have like these mountains where you go up on these walks and you like meet the master on the way up, and he gives you these lessons. So when you get to the top of the mountain, you've like kind of like become the new apprentice or master or whatever.
Mm.
But he's like, they're all on the road there, or like the path there.
Yeah.
And if you just took a jet line tram up, you wouldn't get to see the wisdom of all these masters that have spent all that time on the path.
Mm.
So I wonder if maybe that's like the reason why we don't have these cultural understandings of how to use this technology is because no one's been a master yet.
Mm.
And we haven't met the masters.
And what do you think? Like, let's say the Kung Fu master, right? That person's part of a tradition.
Mhm.
It goes back years, and this apprenticeship and this part of it. How do you have a tradition of AI?
Mm.
Yeah.
Tradition of a smartphone. It doesn't matter how many numbers. What are we on for the current smartphone number?
15.
15.
15 if you're talking, yeah,
iPhones.
if you're talking Apple.
Yeah. So like, okay, fine, right? But that's not a tradition. That's less than 20 years.
Right. Yeah. Man, and I'll tell you that iPhone 15 makes the iPhone 14 look like the iPhone 13. That titanium rim, it is better.
The Super Bowl ad convinced me.
Yeah. There's this new venture. I'm curious what your take is. We've got, I think off the top of my head, I know of 4 schools around the country that are proposing to teach some measure of the liberal arts along with trades. What are your thoughts?
So this seems clearly well, let's make 2 notes. They're not all devoted to teaching the liberal arts along with trades.
Okay.
They're all devoted to teaching some kind of Catholic education alongside trades. Which I think is an important distinction.
Okay.
I'm, in fact, a relative once removed with Mike Sullivan, the president of St. Joseph's the Worker College in Ohio.
Yep.
But also excited about the thing happening in Michigan, the thing happening down in New Mexico, and I know the people that in California as well. So and I think there's other ones that will be starting as time goes on. So, look, it is clear that Catholic education in the trades is a really essential thing.
Okay.
One, we have a dearth of trades workers. And if you want to go into the trades in a culture that's saturated with a pursuit of gross pleasure, money, and power as the normative baseline, you are often surrounded by people who are not of the highest moral or spiritual caliber. And it's a real challenge if you want to get into plumbing or electrical work or something along those lines. So yeah,
James DeMasi said that to me one time. Yeah, I think it was between sophomore and junior year. He's like, Jonathan, the biggest trouble with working carpentry is you got to work with shitheads.
is
like, and he's like, I'm sorry, man, it's true. Yeah.
I had a friend who's he's working to become a journeyman plumber, which is great, noble profession. And on break, all of those guys take out their phones and they're watching porn.
Yep.
Right. That's soul killing. So yes, do we want young men and young women to enter into great trades and be good Catholic tradesmen and be able to learn those trades not in an utterly moral bankrupt society?
Sure.
Yes, great. And do we think that, as we said, part of the Christian faith involves forming the intellect? And so at the age when you're especially inclined to form your intellect, you could have formation not only in the trade, but some kind of Catholic catechesis and training and worldview. That seems great.
Okay.
So all of that, I think, are good things and worthwhile things.
No.
I'll note, because my wife is a deep disciple of Maria Montessori. The Maria Montessori says the ideal time to learn a trade is in high school. That at a certain point doing high school, that's a great time to practice and learn either on a farm or a ranch, but work with your hands, apprentice under someone, really learn it. And this is not what Maria Montessori says, but this I will think is pretty clear from my observation of young people, that 18 to 22 is really an exceptional time to study philosophy.
Oh, interesting.
Not just philosophy abstractly, but a kind of philosophy of life.
Yeah.
You're really proportioned to do that. So in my ideal world, what would happen is high school would be fundamentally a vocational tech school with some basic training in grammar, mathematics, and maybe some writing and basic
rhetoric.
Basic rhetoric, perhaps.
Okay.
But you're really fundamentally doing a trade. You're learning wood shop. My daughter's in the wood shop here at Lander High School.
Yeah.
She loves it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And she's got this sense of accomplishment. And then she goes to, some of these other more traditional high school classes. And she's an intelligent young woman, but she's not moved by them. Right.
Okay.
She's really satisfied by what they're doing. So in an ideal world, I just say, I think everyone should do the trade in high school. then they could use the trade to help pay their way through their 4 years of liberal arts.
Right, right. Forget being a barista.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put electrical panels in people's houses.
That's right. You know,
That's
I'm
gonna
working
pay
for,
for it.
you know, I've got pretty close to, you know, I'm past apprentice on my way to journeyman,
Mm,
and I can work 10, 15 hour a week, picking up some jobs and substantially pay down my tuition
yeah.
while I pursue something along the lines of the philosophical education.
Mm,
So this is where my other caveat is I think it is great to have those,
Mhm.
and there's clearly a need for these trade schools. I think the mistake is to suggest that you can, in fact, do a full liberal arts
mm.
college level education and also become a tradesman at the same time.
Right, right.
No, because basically what you have to say is, well, we're going to do it in 2 years. We're going to do 2 years of liberal arts or less than 2 years of liberal arts
Right.
and have a 6-year path to becoming a journeyman.
Mm,
And you end up having to say, well, okay, so maybe 4 years of liberal arts education is not essential.
you're right. Right.
Now, I don't know if the magic number is 4, maybe the magic number is 3, but I know it's more than 2.
Okay.
That somewhere between 18 and 22, spending 3 to 4 years,
Hmm.
carefully reflecting on the tradition that you've inherited, who you are, and what the meaning of life is a really important thing to do.
Okay. And you think there's a cognitive window that happens at those specific ages?
Absolutely.
That's so interesting. I remember talking with students and colleagues, and asking them, again, Robert Carlson would say WCC is founded in response to a crisis in Western civilization. So many of the liberal arts have been lost in that fundamental education of the young person. We have to cover some lost ground. And so I remember asking students, in all sincerity, will there be a day when the liberal arts don't have to be taught in college between 18 and 22, because those things will have been taught to our young people starting at, say, 7. But your way of thinking is, no, there's an opportunity.
Yep.
When you have just enough experience with just enough openness, that there's this magic moment.
And what exactly is the essential content of that education?
Okay.
I think there's some variability there.
Okay. So maybe logic could be taught at 14.
Though admittedly, I will say that I have taught college level logic classes
Mm-hmm.
to people who took logic in high school.
Okay.
And the kinds of conversations you have about logic in college are not the kind of conversations you have about logic in high school, which is not the case. I've taught Euclid to Euclidean geometry to students who had taken Euclidean geometry in high school. But the way you were thinking about those questions at 18 is different.
Oh.
Now, does that mean that, okay, you couldn't do sufficient Euclidean geometry or sufficient levels of logic or various things in high school and various things?
Okay.
I don't know, right? The experiment of universal high school is what, 2 generations old in America?
At best.
At best, right? You know, my parents' generation was probably the first generation where it was expected that everyone goes to high school.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's about right.
Maybe a little bit
Well,
earlier.
I mean, that raises the question, Kyle, are you and I really part of, which generation?
Yeah, that's right.
We may be
Right.
part of the last generation.
Right. I'm on that. I'm not.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Not a. Yeah. Which letter do I give myself?
Yeah.
But,
Well, it's not Z. Yeah.
that's
You're
right.
not allowed to give yourself the Z.
self-identify as a Gen Z. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's a fair question about, okay, what exactly does it look
Okay.
like?
Yep.
But I do think that there is a kind of philosophical thinking and a kind of and by philosophical thinking I mean most broadly, not just studying philosophy, but a way of reading literature, a way of doing theology, a way of thinking about mathematical constructs and things that is worldview forming from in that 18 to 22 zone. Now is a little bit younger than 18, a little bit older than 22, probably, right? Like these are not hard and fast.
Right.
It's interesting you mentioned that because I heard once from Jordan Peterson, he's saying that his primary audience are young men between middle teens to middle 20s.
Yep.
People who are looking for those anchor points
Yeah.
in their lives.
Well, and it was, there's a Jesuit priest I know who said, Jesuit education sets a trajectory for life when it does grade school and college.
Mm.
Mm.
Those are the two foundational hinge points that
Okay.
dictate a direction in life.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if you have a bizarre college education, depending on what you did in grade school, there may be still some foundations.
Mm-hmm.
But if you had a terrific high school education, and then you go to a college education that is fundamentally sectarian or secular or woke or whatever,
It can mess you up.
it can utterly destroy you.
Mm.
Okay.
Why? Well, because that's the point when you're looking for broad principled, you're able to think abstractly
Okay.
for yourself
Hmm.
in a really distinctive way.
Wow.
I think a lot of people in that age too are dealing with the angst.
Mm.
It's like the questions of like, was the past 18 years of my life worthwhile? And how do I make the next 20, 30, 40 worthwhile?
Mm.
And something I've heard with like my generation, Gen Z, is that people in my generation only want to do work now that they see is super valuable. They
Mm.
don't want to work a humdrum job.
Right.
I gotta work this this job that'll affect some real change.
Yeah,
Mm.
exactly.
Okay.
Which puzzles, the older generation is like, get a job, put food on the table, what's wrong
Mm.
with you, get some experience. Right. But I think in part it's because Gen Z is not having the experience of figuring out mission and vision in college really clearly.
Yeah.
Right.
They're taking classes. They're fundamentally devoted to having them get a job for the sake of making money and getting power. And they're like, I'm not really sold on that.
Right. Well, and boomers were given the mission was get married, get a good job, have a family, keep America great. Right. Like
Right.
the mission was given.
Right.
And the way to participate in the mission was have a car, have a house with a garage, raise some kids in suburbia. Like whether or not the vision was the best one, the vision was there. Whereas now, what the tail end of the millennials and Gen Z is dealing with, we're like, we're not really sure about the vision at all.
Right.
And we're definitely not sure about your vision.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
I think with some cause, but it is, I think fundamentally because we've just left out the idea of thinking about a philosophy of life as an important stage of education.
Okay.
Mm.
Yeah.
And again, anyone who has taught high school, I think is probably going to agree with me that you can do some philosophy of life stuff, but you're just not actually doing the same project.
Okay. For high schoolers, the paradigm is still defined by the household you're in.
Yep.
Whereas at 18 to 22, you are at the stage where you're open to new paradigms.
Whereas that's where I think for high schoolers, I think with some great deal of profit, you could be learning a trade, apprenticing under someone outside the house.
Yeah.
But in a certain sense, getting particular experience to equip you to think more broadly about philosophy of
Okay.
life
Right. Lane
in that
right.
next stage.
Right. Tilling the soil before you put in the seeds.
Because you could be learning a trade that's it's a mechanical skill. It's like understanding how parts go together, how you assemble those for a specific end. You're not asking the major questions of like, why am I here? Things like that. So you can learn those things in conjunction with living your family, experiencing your friendships, all those things without making the next stage of like, what do I want my whole life to look like?
Exactly. So I think learn a trade,
Yeah.
read some great books, or good books, as John Senior would say. Some good books that really are inspiring and exciting. Do some good catechism. Learn the basics of writing and mathematics, so that you're equipped at that next stage of education to really engage in a philosophy of life. What's the good life? What am I here for? How do I pursue it?
Yeah.
Well, that's really great stuff. And honestly, Kyle, we could keep you here all night picking your brain about stuff, but I know that you've got a lot of demands on your plate. You got a family to get back to, so we should probably should probably let you go.
Well, this has just been delightful.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We'd love to have you back.
Yeah.
Where can people get more if they're not enrolled as students at WCC? Where can people find more of your work, find more of your contributions to this educational project?
So I think we're trying to add a number of links to podcasts and talks and things that I've been on my bio page at wyomingcatholic.edu.
Okay.
Again, the irony there, every time someone asks me this question, I'm like, oh, just go on the internet. Breaking the technology
Right, right.
for our cultural norm. So I will say, in general, I think that the best thing to do to try to get a sense of what I'm thinking and what I'm hoping for is come visit Lander, Wyoming. I
Okay.
really think it is hard for most people to imagine what it's like to in Lander, Wyoming.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful small town. The mountains are gorgeous. There's an incredible, vibrant faith community. There's a great college, obviously.
Right.
But
There's no interstate.
that's right.
There's no interstate highway that runs to Lander, Wyoming.
Right.
That
We
might be
are
important.
off. We are off the interstate. We are trying to reclaim paths, by golly, slowly but surely.
Yeah.
But no, I think it is really worth visiting Lander. I'd probably recommend visiting Lander in the summer months.
that might be the only time when one physically can actually visit Lander.
But it is a remarkable place. And in a sense, all of my cool theories, or what I think are cool theories about education or society and culture, are deeply, deeply formed by my undergraduate experience at Thomas Aquinas College and my life in Lander with this incredible community. So I think people should, if they really want to know what I'm thinking, just come visit Lander.
Just come sit in on the baseball game on Sunday afternoon, see it for themselves.
That's right.
Well, good. Well, cheers to that. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hope we can have you back soon. And in the meantime, for all the listeners here on the Green Dragon, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. And we'll be back with more very shortly. Once again, gratitude to Kyle Washut, president of Wyoming Catholic College, for giving us his time and his wisdom.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.